there were these two cats, an English cat, 123, and a French cat, un, deux, trois, and they both had this big puddle to cross. Only the English cat made it across because un, deux, trois cat sank.
Linux Luddites, episode 76, for the 18th of April, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Paddy. A number of you recently asked why I've been so dismissive of Syncthing in the past, so we decided it'd be worth taking a proper look at how the project's matured. That'll be coming up after the news, and then following your feedback, Joe and Jesse will be talking to Pritam D'Souza about the Maru OS project, which brings the full Linux desktop to your mobile phone. It sounds like a pretty full show, so shall we just get on with it?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's start off the news then with the Linux Stable Security Tree project, which is a branch of Linux Stable, which instead of getting all of the patches, will only get security patches. But my understanding is that all patches for the Linux kernel, certainly in Stable, all bug fixes are potentially security fixes anyway. So this is a bit of a confusing one for me.
Yeah, I think you're right that potentially that issue is there. But the argument is that security bugs aren't flagged up as a generality from the kernel team. And if you're trying to maintain a code base for your Internet of Things device, for instance, which is running on the Linux Stable branch, you really haven't got time to go through everything and work out whether it applies to you or not. So it'd be really nice if there was a single sort of source of truth out there to go to say, yep, that's a security bug, it needs to be applied.
But they're not actually very well flagged, these security bugs at the moment. But I don't actually see it as a problem. You just need to make sure that going forward, someone has a more clear idea, or they lay down a rule book or framework for what is security and what is, like you say, just a general patch, so that this project could go forward. Although you are then going to have another sort of branch of the Linux kernel, which is then maintained and have these people keep it up to date and things like this. And you talked about Internet of Things devices there, Paddy, and the problem that we've discussed in the past is that they rarely actually get updates. So assuming that they do get kernel updates, it seems like a sensible idea. I'm just a bit concerned that the devices which need it won't get the updates anyway, and so it won't solve any problems because the fundamental problem is further downstream than the Linux kernel itself.
Yeah, I can see that potentially being an issue, but just to return to Joe's point about every bug potentially being a security bug, I mean, that's true, but not everybody uses all the kernel. I mean, the kernel is a massive thing, and it's partly obviously down to the inherent nature of having a monolithic kernel as opposed to one of these nice little microkernels that are becoming a little bit more fashionable now. So potentially when there is a bug that's fixed and it's posted on the Linux Stable branch at the moment, it could be relating to a subsystem that you aren't actually using within your project. So there's no good reason for you to include it.
Sounds like once again the solution is to use the herd then.
That's never a solution, Joe, and you well truly know it.
Well, we'll be talking about the FSF later on in the show, not surprisingly. But let's move on to their current best friends, Canonical.
Absolutely. So Canonical are quite a fundamental part of LXC, the Linux containers, and we just had announced LXD version 2.0. So LXD is a daemon which runs with the software from the Linux containers, but the Linux container is only a command line tool. So LXD allows a better use of implementation, spin them up, and also being able to maintain them when you have multiple containers and things. So it's quite a big milestone here, and is obviously not so much a competitor to Docker, but an alternative depending on how you want to run your containers.
Isn't it LexD, like some sort of rubbish supervillain?
Are you going to start prompting me whenever I say Qt now?
Yeah.
Yeah, right, okay. So yes, maybe it is LexD. I don't listen to many other podcasts that call it that, or haven't heard it, or YouTube videos, what have you, but if you're telling me it's LXD, then let's go with that. But it does look like a very useful addition to LXC, and as you said, Paddy, Canonical are quite big proponents of this and have put a lot of effort into Linux container code. And as more and more of these are spun up, obviously having a nice way of managing your various containers is a very useful thing. So this is probably going to be very widely used in the server space and providers of infrastructure as a service, so you can manage those remotely without having to use all of the command line tools that LXC has.
Just think about the LXD comment a minute ago. I know this is totally off topic, but you said daemon. Now, I always say demon because it's an English word, and I know it used to be spelt daemon in English as well before we dropped the A. I mean, what do you guys think it actually should be pronounced as?
I did always used to call it daemon, and I thought it was one of those funny little Linux quirks that they thought, oh, isn't it funny that the little demon's running in the background? But I guess I just have read it so many times as with a funny spelling of daemon that I pronounce the A now. Joe?
I don't know, really. It depends what mood I'm in, I think.
As ever, fence sitting.
Well, I just don't say it often enough to care, to be honest.
All right, sorry, I was just going down a rabbit hole, but let's come out of that then. Let's talk about Switzerland, and specifically the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and also the University of Bologna. And they've together jointly developed an open source processor called the Pulpino. Now, a Pulpino is a 32-bit CPU that's designed to be really energy efficient, and it's targeted towards the Internet of Things and wearables and stuff like that. And apparently it uses the Open RISC-V instruction set, and we've talked about that on the show before. And this design is apparently comparable to the Cortex M4 from ARM.
You say low power. We're talking 32.8 milliwatts. That is seriously low power.
Yeah, this is for devices that will run on batteries for a very long time, isn't it?
Yeah, I would have thought so. This is real Internet of Things stuff, isn't it?
But is the headline here the fact that they've made a really good Internet of Things processor, or is it that it's an open processor?
I think the headline is that it's an open processor. I mean, all the work's been released under a permissive license. And unlike some of the other open chips designs that we've talked about before, this isn't just an RTL design. They've actually taped out real CPUs.
Yeah, because I've heard quite a lot recently about x86 and the fact that it has so many closed binary blobs and things that if people are able to access those or use those in a nefarious way, it can really compromise your system. Whereas at least having all of this, actually having open processors is a very rare thing. It's just unfortunate that this happens to be at the very, very, very low end, and it's not something you're going to use on a day-to-day basis, is it?
Well, it depends. If the hype about Internet of Things is to be believed, then we will be using them on a day-to-day basis, just not in laptops and powerful phones. But it's good that at least one area of computing will have a serious competitor, a serious player in the market that is totally open. It's a good place to start from, I think.
Yeah, we always seem to be a bit lacking on the hardware side. I mean, software's relatively straightforward to write, and obviously there are no reproduction costs. It kind of comes back to the whole arguments about licensing, what have you, which we'll get into a bit later on. But hardware is a lot harder because you've actually got physical manufacturing costs there in the real world. So that's clearly why things lag a little bit on that side of the fence. But it's great to see initiatives like this and more open hardware coming to market.
Well, hopefully this processor won't end up in devices that just get totally abandoned like the Revolve has. So I've seen a lot of people talking about this over the last week or so. And Revolve is a home automation hub, and the company was bought by Google a while back, or Alphabet, or whatever they're calling it this week. And it's going to be abandoned, and not to the point that we normally talk about old versions of Android, for example, where they get abandoned and never get any updates, but you can happily use them, security flaws aside. This home automation hub is going to just cease to work. They're going to remotely disable them, effectively. So people who have spent all this money getting fancy door openers and lights coming on and off and temperature controls and all that kind of thing are just going to not be able to use their expensive piece of kit anymore, which is quite frankly outrageous if you ask me.
Yeah, this is a bad sort of light of things to come because, as you said, the whole point of this is that you can tie in every home automation item from your house. So you can have like your heating controlled, your lights. When you get back home, it can turn the music on, the locks on your doors, the blinds, everything. And so if you've put all your eggs in this basket, you are well and truly up a certain creek because your entire plan of automating everything has just been taken apart. And like you say, Joe, it's not that they've just said, oh, we're not going to support it any longer. It will just be frozen where it is, carry on without any updates. It is being remotely stopped. It's a bit like the article where someone had all their books on their Kindle taken away by Amazon remotely because they'd not paid or done something illegitimate or illegal, what have you. And so it is a worrying thing. And I have to admit, having Tado, which is reliant on the servers that Tado have for me to be able to communicate with my heating, it did sort of, struck home. I thought, well, if they went bankrupt or if they suddenly stopped, I would have to, it wouldn't be that difficult. I'd just put my old analog thermostat back on the wall, but it'd be kind of annoying. And a friend of mine has recently got a Raspberry Pi and found a way of making a Raspberry Pi type Tado, and so you sort of hack it into your the radio frequency that it uses for a normal remote thermostat. And he's got various bits and bobs, and he's trying to make websites for it, and a little app that can control things. And I really was impressed because that is taking the same functionality of what I have, but having it entirely within his own control. And it's these Internet of Things devices that are in someone else's control that they can do whatever they like with it. And it's a really worrying precedence if this is, if this happens multiple times.
Yeah, and it's bound to happen multiple times. And we were talking on off air before we started recording about driverless cars, and any sort of device like that that's going to be remotely updatable. I know this is slightly different because this was actually talking back to a server which went away. You're going to have the same sort of issue, and that really gives me huge pause for thought, and I would think it would other people as well.
Well, we often beat the drum for open standards on this show, but this is a prime example, isn't it? Where if this device had been using open standards, and fair enough, you might pay to use their servers to control it, but if the servers go away, at least if it was using open standards, you could point it towards a server that you were running, and therefore you wouldn't have effectively a brick sitting in your house now rather than the hub that you thought you had.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. But wait a minute, Paddy, how have you put this news story so far down? This is surely the news story of the fortnight. Remix OS 2 is now available on the cutting edge Nexus 10. This is incredible news.
And the Nexus 9, to be fair.
All right, yeah, and the Nexus 9. So the Nexus 10 came out sort of late 2012, the Nexus 9 late 2014, and they're the two biggest Nexus devices you can have. And Giant has recently announced that they've released their version 2 of Remix OS to run on both of those. And it's a little bit, I guess, trying to get out before Google, because everyone's saying that the new release of Android N, which is coming out in the summer, is likely to have floating windows and things like this. So, obviously Android is moving towards a desktop-like interface, and where you have a much bigger screen, floating windows are a lot more useful rather than on a little tiny phone or what have you. And so if you have one of these, which I'm surprised many people do, because let's be honest, the Nexus 10, the Nexus 9 were never great sellers, you could go and use Remix OS if you so wish.
I don't know about not being good sellers. I know the Nexus 7 has been slightly better, but I think the 10 was quite popular in its day. I think there are a lot of those kicking around. Popular
enough for one of the hosts of this show to have.
What, so you had one?
Yeah, I had a Nexus 10 when it first came out, and it was great, very useful, good for watching videos and everything, the massive screen. But the X now has it, so it's not in my house any longer.
Oh, yeah, you lost that in the divorce, didn't you? Yeah.
yeah, the great divorce.
Well, we're coming back to talk about windowed environments on Android, or maybe not, later on in the show. For now, though, let's talk about WhatsApp. And although their announcement recently got quite a lot of press, it got very little coverage on any podcast that I listened to. And I was rather surprised about that, because as far as I'm concerned, this is the biggest tech event we've had this year so far.
So you're talking about the fact that all WhatsApp messages are going to be encrypted end-to-end now, are encrypted end-to-end now.
Well, they are encrypted as long as you're on the latest version of WhatsApp.
Yeah, which if you're on Android or iOS, surely it just auto updates anyway. So I don't think there are many people not using the latest version, to be fair.
Yeah, and what we're talking about here, of course, is WhatsApp working with the guys from Whisper Systems to roll the Signal protocol into WhatsApp. And at a stroke, that has given secure encrypted communication for over 1 billion people on the planet.
Well, has it? Because WhatsApp's still proprietary, so who knows what else it's doing behind the scenes.
Well, they have released the white paper on how Signal works, and in it they discuss the fact that once you've encrypted end-to-end, not just on single-person chats, but on multi-person chats and videos and telephone calls, all these things, every part of WhatsApp is encrypted. Not even WhatsApp can read what's going on because of the way the encryption works. Their servers just see gobbledygook. And I did try and get my way through the white paper. It's not a huge, white paper. It's not really, really detailed that no one can understand. It's fairly good as long as you're geeky enough. And I'm not going to say that I understood all of it, but it just interested me, the fact that everyone says that doing end-to-end encryption is really, really difficult because you have to share keys and, GPG and all these sorts of things. But they're doing it without me having done anything. And, my non-techie friends are all now using encrypted services. They probably saw the little text on WhatsApp that said, your chat is now encrypted end-to-end, and they probably ignored it. But at least, like you said, Paddy, it has now been rolled out to everyone on WhatsApp, and it's now a huge thing. And in the context of the number of people using an encrypted chat service. So I also think it's a really, really big news story.
I remember what feels like a long time ago on this show talking about GPG and how it was tricky to use and saying, I'm sure there must be someone out there who's far cleverer than I am who will come up with a way to make end-to-end encryption easy to use. And I suppose this might be that.
I think it is that. I mean, you're right, it's proprietary, so we can't see the code and verify it, but the same stands for Telegram. I mean, the client might be open source, but the server side of things certainly isn't. And, I mean, this is the guys from Whisper Systems. I mean, this is Moxie Marlinspike we're talking about, who I would trust implicitly in comparison with an awful lot of other security experts out there. And we have to remember the Signal protocol they're using in this product is actually released under the GPL v3. So obviously Whisper Systems have gone along to WhatsApp and decided to let them have it under a different license so that it can be rolled into their proprietary code. And I think that's incredibly generous of them, to be honest.
Yeah, I found that a bit strange. If Signal's GPL v3, then it shouldn't be allowed, but I suppose they can make a special exception then.
Yeah, I mean, the owners of the copyright can license it under whatever terms they like to anybody else, even though it remains under GPL v3 to the rest of us. And as I say, it seems very generous to me, and it's putting people ahead of the importance of code. And that is the permissive way of doing things. It's obviously not the FSF way of doing things, and we'll come back to that a little later on. But, I mean, a lot of other people have taken this as a very positive step as well. I mean, the EFF said, quote, "It's difficult to overstate the importance of this move for the security and privacy of ordinary users." And as I say, I agree with that entirely.
But I don't know, what about this issue of it being proprietary? I mean, it's all well and good to have all the encryption in the world and perfect forward secrecy and all that kind of stuff. But if the application itself is proprietary, then surely that just undermines it all. I don't want to keep coming back to this, but I think it's an important point.
It is an important point, but I don't think you can let the desire for the best be the enemy of the good, or whatever the expression is. I wouldn't trust Facebook in the slightest. I trust Moxie.
So I suppose what you're saying is it's better to have something than nothing. Okay, fair enough. I'm just a bit of a dreamer, I suppose.
Yeah, and there are probably open source solutions out there, but not many people use them. I know a lot of folks in the tech community have picked up on Telegram, despite its obvious shortcomings server side. But it's tech people who are using it. I mean, my daughter uses WhatsApp. Her friends use WhatsApp. Everybody I know, apart from tech people, use WhatsApp. So the network effect of having that inbuilt user base means this is just incredibly helpful from the get-go, whereas on a lot of other products, you're looking at a very small user base, and they're never going to gain traction simply because of the small user base. I mean, it's why any competitor to Twitter's never taken off, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah, but it'd be nice if they could open source it. I still think they could make money if they open sourced it, but I suppose they're not going to do that anytime soon.
Well, they being Facebook in this case. And I think that's sort of part of what I took away from this was the fact that Apple have had a lot of positive press recently to do with them not opening the phone for the FBI, even though the FBI have basically demanded that they do. And if Facebook are able to, this is the only way that Facebook can sort of say the same thing. They don't have an operating system. They don't have a way of encrypting phones and things like this, but they do own WhatsApp. Like you say, Paddy, it is used by everyone I know apart from you, Joe. And so it is hugely, hugely popular. And if someone is having a conversation on WhatsApp and bad things happen as a result of the conversation and the planning which comes from that conversation, and the FBI or whoever, maybe it's the GCHQ from our country, what have you, demand that they show them the logs, Facebook will get a lot of positive public press from the fact that they can say, well, we're providing security for our users and it's very important and blah, blah, blah. So while this is not only good for the end user, it's good for Facebook as well. And we may be in a very odd situation where it actually benefits everyone.
Yeah, I would throw one caveat in, kind of harks back to what you just said though, Jesse. I mean, we are talking about the contents of chats being encrypted here. We're not talking about encrypting the metadata around all that. So who you've been chatting to, when you chatted to them and for how long is all going to be publicly accessible to the FBI.
Oh, right. I hadn't realised that, but yeah, an important point to note for sure.
And I guess just to round off this topic, the Signal desktop beta is now publicly available. So if you're running Chrome, you can install that and link it to your mobile phones and chat quite happily, very securely with everybody else in the world, apart from Joe.
Just send me an email, honestly, with this modern technology. Well, speaking of modern technology, let's talk about Firefox. Ha 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 ha. And a quite link-baity headline from the Register. The future of Firefox is Chrome. And the reality of this story is that there is a small team working on a kind of new version of Firefox, a different version that is going to be based on some different technologies. Rather than Gecko, it's going to have Electron, which is part of what makes Chromium run, and it's going to be called Tofino. But this is not guaranteed to be what the future of Firefox is. It's just one idea. It's a small team that are kind of working in isolation on this to try and make Firefox better and totally rewrite it by the sounds of things. But I don't know, to call it the future of Firefox, I think is a bit disingenuous. I think it's a possible future, a possible timeline maybe. But in the meantime, it's still trucking on with Gecko and continuing to lose market share.
It is. I mean, what really struck me about this story was how quickly they rode back on things. I mean, you mentioned Electron there. I mean, the quote from Mark Mayo in his post on Medium originally was, "The prototype we're feeling good about right now is built with Electron and React, not Gecko and Zool." And that got a lot of pushback, and they very rapidly changed their minds and said, "Oh, we're only messing around with the interface. Might put some wrappers around Gecko, but it's always going to be based on Gecko." And the amount of backpedaling there was what really grabbed me with this story.
Yeah, it seems fair to me that they should have a small independent team who start from, a blank slate, bit of blue sky thinking and say, what is the best out there from the visual point of view that the end user gets to see? So they're looking at the user interface design, and also what is the best back end to use on the web browser. And if they're allowed to think of anything, they're of course going to look at all of the competition. But to then release this and say, we're looking at all this competition, they're bound to get pushback. They're bound to get people who love Firefox as it is, and the fact that Firefox runs on a back end independent of Google and Chrome, all these things. So yeah, they should have just said, well, this is what we're looking at. We haven't decided anything yet. And it's not actually going to be, there's no roadmap that says this will be the future. It's just, why don't we look at what the options are? Which seems like a fairly sensible idea, because if you don't constantly look at what you're doing and step back and take in the bigger picture, you can go down a little rabbit hole, and before you know it, you're entirely irrelevant, which some people may say Firefox already is.
Is this too little too late, though, for them? That's you kind of implied that there, that it might be, and I think it probably is Chrome now has got to the point where it's just dominating, and it seems that fewer and fewer people are using Firefox, and almost nobody I know still uses it. Everyone has moved over to Chrome now.
I guess the bigger question is, where will Firefox get their money from going forward? I mean, they've currently got to deal with Yahoo as a primary income source, but Yahoo is going through upheaval, I think is a fair way of putting it at the moment, and it's certainly been quite widely trailed that there's a potential there for Microsoft to be buying Yahoo in the fairly near term.
Yeah, and I suppose if that happens, they're not likely to keep giving Mozilla any money, are they?
I don't think so, no.
So Firefox might go the way of Thunderbird then and just get kind of given to the community, and it'll just become this minority browser that hardly anyone uses anymore.
But then what does Firefox have? There's no phone, there's no email client. The web browser is the face of Mozilla, isn't it? It seems like they'll have nothing left.
Nothing left but a big pot of money to spend on, I don't know, go for a nice holiday maybe.
Well, speaking about financing, we talked about the Brave web browser a few shows ago, and a bunch of publishers have got together from the US. So 17 publishers representing 1,700 newspapers have basically said, don't do this or we're going to take legal action against you. So the quote from this letter is, your plan to use our content to sell your advertising is indistinguishable from a plan to steal our content to publish it on your own website. So Brave, for those who've forgotten or weren't there, their plan is to block all adverts when you use their browser and then replace them with adverts that Brave have selected. And then the money from those adverts, 15% will go to the user, either to take themselves or to donate to their favorite website. 15% of the profits will go to Brave, 15% to the advertising partners, and then the rest of it, the 55% balance, will actually go to the original publisher of the website. So they will be getting money, but obviously not as much as they would originally have had those main adverts that they wanted gone on there. Now, Brave have sort of fought back and have said that they will be going through with this, and they've basically said that there are many ad blockers out there, so they're not the first to do this, and also things like Safari's reader mode and the Lynx text-only browser that both get rid of adverts, or Pocket, for example. They do the same thing, so what's the difference?
Yeah, and Firefox even has a mode like that, a reader mode, I think they call it. So it's a bit of a thorny one, this, isn't it? You can kind of see it from the publisher's point of view, but it sounds a bit spurious, doesn't it, to say that it's like hosting our content yourself. Well, not really. You're putting that content on the internet, on the web, and people are just choosing to only take the content and not the stuff that's wrapped around it. So I think it's a bit of a flimsy argument, and it sounds like just strong arm tactics with the legal challenge here. I don't think that they're going to win, because if it were to ever go in front of a jury, surely they would lose.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's kind of why I put it in the news, because I can genuinely see both sides here. I mean, I can see what you're saying there, Joe, and in particular, because these content creators, if we're going to call them that, actually aren't in control of the content that's going out there. I mean, they will say there's going to be an advert in this position on the page, but they aren't actually dictating exactly what that advert's going to be at publication time. It will depend on who's viewing the page, what gets served up to them. So they haven't got full control anyway. But equally, I can see their argument that their content's being ripped off. Now, whether we agree with the copyright laws or not, and I certainly don't, they are the laws. And if you take a whole lot of content from somebody that's not just under fair use, then you are infringing their copyright. So I can see both sides here.
Well, I think one of the most interesting takeouts from this is from the Interactive Advertising Bureau. And they basically start off by saying, Brave, stop it. We're going to come down and stop you from doing what you're planning on doing. But they sort of go on and make an interesting point looking back at the publishers and the content creators. And sorry for the overly use of quotes, but I thought it was quite a good one. They said, ad blocking is a crucial wake-up call to brands and all that serve them about their abuse of consumers' goodwill. Ad blockers are exploiting a real vulnerability, the erosion of stimulating consumer experiences online. For this, the marketing media ecosystem bears real responsibility. And I think that's true. Basically, people don't like the way in which they're served stuff, because it's, you have pop-ups and you have things that start playing and videos, and it's just quite an annoying way of looking at things on the web. It's just quite interfering. And so of course you put an ad blocker on to try and make it a more streamlined and comfortable experience. So I think it is a wake-up call, and I'm the same as you, Paddy. I can see both sides of this. But the fact that all Brave is doing is lumping an ad blocker in with the web browser, isn't that what iOS was doing? They've allowed you to have, or they've put an ad blocker in as standard, haven't they?
Yeah, I don't think it is the same though, because if you're blocking ads, you're not gaining financially from that. Whereas what Ike here is doing with Brave is trying to gain financially himself by actually replacing those adverts with Brave-approved adverts.
Well, so it's a sensible way of doing it, but from the content creator's point of view, they're still having their adverts blocked. So they're just a little bit sort of sour grapes that they're not getting that someone else is making money off of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think their argument is you're nicking all of our valuable content, ignore the advert side of things, which nobody thinks is valuable. You're taking the actual stuff we've worked on and using our bandwidth to serve it up to somebody and then monetizing that for yourself only.
Yeah, because we're talking about crossing a line here. Whereas they've never been fond of ad blockers, the publishers of content. That was one thing. But we're talking about crossing the line to the point where you're now profiting from it, rather than depriving them of any money and just viewing the content. It's a case of you're depriving them of money and making your own money. So I can see why they think this is crossing a line, but I don't know. It is a very tricky one, and I too can see both sides, but I think ultimately I fall down on the side of Brave just about on this. But one thing that occurred to me while reading about this again is it's just a massive recipe for click fraud. If the person viewing the adverts is getting any money whatsoever from that, and my understanding was that you weren't going to actually get money. You were only going to get kind of money to give other websites and not see adverts on them. But if there's actual money or Bitcoin to be had, then people are just going to set up bots and stuff and just milk this dry. And it's just not going to sustain itself.
Then they'll have to find a way of, spotting what's a bot. And you end up in this classic war of arms, isn't it? It's an arms race as to who can stop the bot and who can make the bot and backs and forwards. But it's only the arms race that's being had in the ad blocker world, where people are, trying to whitelist and blacklist, and the fact that we've spoken a fortnight or a month ago about the French publications who are all coming together to block the blockers, and the blockers are blocking the blocks. So it's just an arms race all round.
Well, I guess if the last story showed the world of copyright isn't always black and white and there's plenty of shades of grey there, it's probably a good thing the FSF exists, and we can always rely on them to see things very black and white. And Richard Stallman has come down from the mountain with his tablets of stone and declared, somewhat unsurprisingly, that, yep, ZFS, Linux, the two do not talk to each other ever.
Well, ever, as long as it's under the same licenses they are now.
That's right. We've been waiting for this missive from above for quite a while now. I don't think it surprised anyone at all, the point that he came out with. The post they put up actually covers some very familiar ground. It states their case quite eloquently. Now, whether their case is an accurate one or not is another matter. And that's something I never hear anyone talk about, the fact that they may have their interpretation of what the GPL, the various versions of the GPL mean. But that is all it is their interpretation. They may have written it, but it's not down to them to interpret it legally. That's down to a court to do. And we haven't had this in court before.
And I don't think that we're likely to have this in court, this particular one of Linux and ZFS, because although the FSF are saying things like, Linux should defend its copyright and the GPL violations and but I don't think that's going to happen, is it? I think that Canonical are going to get away with this because it's not really up to the FSF or Conservancy to actually mount this lawsuit unless Linux wants to do that. So I suppose what would be up to the Linux Foundation to start doing it, or possibly even Oracle.
No, I'm not sure about that, to be honest, because the Conservancy do actually have quite a lot of tame copyright holders from the kernel on their books. And Conservancy did put out a statement saying, obviously, we agree with what Richard has written here. And that's hardly surprising because Karen Sandler also helped write Richard's statement, according to the notes on the end of Richard's statement. And the FSF are saying, and I'm quoting here, we enthusiastically encourage enforcement of the GPL on Linux in accord with these principles, and we wish the enforcers success in bringing violators into compliance, which kind of is like pushing people to actually go down that route. And I've said on a previous show, I think they'd be really daft to do so, to be honest, because I can't see a positive outcome for the FSF if this is pursued, because either they will actually win a judgment here against Canonical, and by Canonical we're obviously talking about Ubuntu, which is hugely important in the ecosystem, and I don't think that will go down very well with an awful lot of people, apart from the very small vocal minority of absolute freedom zealots out there. Or they will lose, and that would equally be very bad for them. I mean, they've survived all this time by making their pronouncements on how they think the interpretation should be, and if that's proven to be wrong, then that really undermines their position. So I can't see a positive outcome either way for how they stand in the community.
I don't think that the FSF really care how popular Ubuntu is, do they? I mean, they stand for their principles, and, you know, RMS is a very firm believer in these principles, and the FSF sort of sit on his coattails, and they will do what is right by the rulebook of the GPL and how they interpret it. And if Ubuntu, you know, is the biggest player in the market, then who cares? So be it. Would be the view I think they would have.
Yeah, and I would go along with that. I think that is exactly their point of view. But it isn't the point of view that is important here for their continuing relevance within the Linux world. I mean, if they burn a lot of bridges here and actually pursue enforcement activities, and they will burn bridges, then the use of the GPL, which has been in decline for years anyway, I think will further decline very rapidly. And I can understand they probably don't care about that because they are a very small insular community. But their influence within the wider Linux ecosystem, I can see just tailing off dramatically.
Well, the other point that you made earlier was that their interpretation of the GPL may well be, you know, just an interpretation. Other people have another view. But from what I remember from our previous talk and the various articles that have come out this week, is that the GPL says that with a GPL'd piece of software, or the source code for that software, if it is used in partnership, let's say, or merged with other software, the combined output of that merging must be licensed under the same GPL as the GPL'd software in the first place. Whereas the license that ZFS is under says that it must be licensed under the license that it has. So you can't combine them because both of them want to end up with a product which has the license from the original source code, and so neither of them are going to win, so you can't possibly merge them. I don't see where there's any I can't see where the different interpretation comes from.
I'm inclined to agree. I don't understand how anyone could possibly argue against this. I mean, you could argue that you don't believe that it should be this way. Fair enough. That we could argue all day. But the facts remain that these two licenses are incompatible, and therefore you can't ship ZFS with Linux. I suppose the nuance is whether or not it's a derivative work. I mean, is that what you're getting at, Paddy?
Yeah, kind of. And that was really what Evan Moglen was talking about previously as well, when we talked about his post from the Software Freedom Law Centre about this previously. And he's also pitched in, and although ostensibly talking about the Linux Foundation, he is very strongly urging people not to pursue legal action and saying that he's spent most of his adult lifetime not telling businesses that copyleft was in their interest, but educating them about copyleft. And the experience has taught him that it's absolutely crucial to the attainment of the free software movement's fundamental objectives not to annoy people, basically, by pursuing what he potentially views as spurious legal actions here.
Can I just ask a sort of tangential question here. Is there any chance that Oracle are going to relicense it? I mean, clearly they're not going to GPL it, but is there any chance of them licensing under a permissive license to make this go away?
Obviously, none of us know the answer to that, but I can't see why they would. I mean, how would it benefit them is the bottom line. I mean, they're a company out there trying to make money. How would it actually benefit their business?
More development on ZFS if it's more widely adopted in Linux and, therefore RHEL and all the rest of that, then more developers looking at it, more people using it, more people reporting bugs and further development of it. The kind of, I suppose, utopian ideals of free software.
Another utopian ideal would be that you make software either to make money out of it or to have it used everywhere. And obviously, when you're charging for your software, to have it used everywhere is synonymous with making money. But if you're not making money out of it, aka these file systems, you would at least have it used far more in the world, and therefore you as a company would be more relevant because everyone has ZFS and the second breath is Oracle.
No, I guess the ideal position for Oracle would be for Ubuntu to get away with this, as you put it earlier, for it to become widely adopted by the likes of Red Hat, and then potentially to reevaluate their position. Because if any action was going to be taken, that would be the time to do it, when it was really going to disrupt your competitors.
Well, so you think they'll just sort of stand by and watch it happen and then kick off about it?
That's a distinct possibility, don't you?
I don't know. Surely that would be quite a weak legal position if they'd let it happen and not pounced on it straight away. I mean, they couldn't argue ignorance, surely. So the question would be, well, why did you wait this long? Clearly to try and disrupt them, and that just doesn't really... I don't know. My understanding of the law is clearly very sketchy, but at least if I was on a jury, I'd be tempted to not let them get away with that.
Yeah, well, that's one of the other points Eben Moglen made previously that we've talked about, was that if it doesn't have enforcement action applied very quickly, then the lack of action implies acceptance that it's an okay thing to do, whether it's explicitly stated or not. So if there is no action quickly, then that is kind of de jure acceptance of it.
Well, yeah, exactly. So how can they then turn around, some months or years down the line and suddenly start taking action?
So your expectation is that the FSF, or, well, Conservancy in this case, since they're the standard bearers for action, will be coming out of the gates rapidly after the release of 1604 and starting legal proceedings against Canonical?
Well, I think they'll be at least attempting to drum up some legal proceedings, but whether or not there are enough people who care enough is the question that remains to be seen. I don't think that there will be. I don't think that we will see any legal action because most people just don't care. It's such a sort of finicky little technicality here. It's 2 bits of free software. Okay, the licenses are incompatible, but does it really matter? And I think the answer to that is no for most people. It's only the real zealots and the people who really care about enforcement generally, that care about it.
But the whole point of having licenses is that you stick by them. The whole point of having principles and writing them down and make sure that people follow them is that you make sure that people follow them. I can't understand how we're letting Canonical get away without any kind of bashing in this conversation, because they're the ones who have come along and go, well, we're big enough, we can do what we like, let's just whack it in there. And because we're, the kind of cloudy and desktop-y main player in the Linux world, we'll do what we like. And I'm sure, like you said, Joe, no one will care about this little minor disagreement between some licenses, and we'll just crack on and watch us go, which seems like a very sort of arrogant status, very arrogant stance to take. And we're sort of discussing how the FSF are being too pernickety, or we're discussing how Oracle might do this if it's in our interest but not in theirs. Whereas actually, this whole thing has come about because Ubuntu seems to be a little bit like, well, let's just do what we like regardless of these licenses, which we're supposed to be following.
I think it all comes down to the question of whether that is the case or not, whether Canonical really believe that they should be allowed to do this or not because of this legal interpretation, this fine detail about the derivative works and combining things and the legalese behind that. do they really believe that what they're about to do is in compliance with the various licenses or not? Are they trying to get away with something, or do they truly believe that there's nothing to get away with because it's fine?
You've hit the nail on the head, I think. I think that's absolutely right. And we talked about it in the last show. We've talked about it in this show. The FSF have come out twice and said, this is what is written in the GPL. This pointing at the one, statements in the GPL that say why it is you're not able to mix the GPL with the ZFS license. And nothing has come out of Canonical. Surely if they had an argument to make, someone has to come out of Canonical and say, this is our interpretation. Not just, oh, we've interpreted it and it's fine. They should say, well, this is the way we've interpreted it, and this is our argument against what the FSF are saying.
No, I don't necessarily agree with you there, Jesse, because the FSF have made their interpretation public. It's their interpretation, as I said up front. It doesn't matter what their interpretation is. It wouldn't matter what Canonical's interpretation is. The only way it would actually be resolved full stop is to take it to court. And I hope it does go to court and we can get some clarity here. In the meantime, everyone else is just free, as we are doing right now, to put forward our interpretation. Doesn't matter what we all think, what Canonical thinks, what the FSF thinks. It's what a court thinks that's important here, and that is the final arbiter.
Yeah, of course that'll be the final arbiter. That'll be what is then written, and everyone will, in the future quote this court case and say, oh, in 2016, FSF versus Canonical, blah, blah, blah. But surely, if, Canonical are generally very open, and to a fault, they release their phone software, people rip them apart for it, and they say, well, we haven't finished it yet, we're just doing it because we're being an open company. To their credit, fine. But you would have thought that with the stir that they've made in the community, they would come out and say, this is our case, that this is our argument, this is our case as to why we think we're okay to lump ZFS in with our next release of Ubuntu. Now, potentially they want to hold their cards close to their chest so that when they go to court, they drop them down and the FSF doesn't have a leg to stand on. And by releasing that early, they forego that sort of kind of moment in court. That's the only reason I could see them not coming out with an actual sort of response to the FSF's position here.
Well, I still don't think it's going to go to court. I think that they will release it, they'll get away with it, or, well, whichever way you want to look at that. I think that the FSF will continue to make a lot of noise, but as you said, with the decline in the GPL, Paddy, I can't help but feel that the FSF is becoming a little bit, not necessarily that they're becoming less relevant, but their voice is heard less and less. But you might be right, we might get a court case, but I suppose, like Linux Outlaws used to say, we'll keep an eye on it. A few shows back, we talked about BitTorrent Sync and how there wasn't a viable open source alternative to that. And we got, I think it's fair to say, a fair bit of feedback saying Syncthing, Syncthing, Syncthing. And that's not something that we'd looked at for a while. I'd never looked at it, but I think, Paddy, you'd looked at it a while back and not thought much of it. And so we thought, well, okay, instead of just criticizing it blindly, maybe we should have a proper look at it. And so we've done that, and I must say that my experience of it over the local network was pretty positive. So I take back my criticism.
Well, that was a short review.
Yeah, let's move on.
So Syncthing is not in the Ubuntu repositories. You have to download the tarball, extract it on your machine, and then once it's extracted, go into the folder, and it's just got a Syncthing script that you run. And once that's done its thing, creates some keys and is running, it ticks over in the terminal, it automatically pops up a web browser, which is the GUI interface. So it just goes to your local host, and I can't remember what port it is, but it goes to there and it just gives you quite an elegant, simple interface showing you which folder you're sharing, and it automatically makes a sync folder in your home directory, and then you can pick which devices you want to add to sync and which folders to sync with what, and restart it, and just have sort of control over the Syncthing client.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of restarting involved, isn't there?
Oh my word, there's a lot of restarting involved. Yeah, definitely.
Is there? I don't recall that. I just added a line to my sources, did the apt-get update and installed it, run it, and that was it.
No, not restarting your machine, restarting the actual client.
Ah, right, yeah, okay.
Every time you make a change, I don't know why they can't just keep an eye on what's happening with the config file and actually reread it periodically. But every time you make a change, you have to restart it. I mean, it's a quick process, but it's still a little bit irksome.
Yeah, fair enough. And to put this in a bit of context, I also looked at BitTorrent Sync because it's been an awfully long time. And in terms of the setup of that and the clunkiness, it felt very similar. These two do feel very similar to each other in terms of what they can do and how you get it working.
So, well, I guess once you're up and running and you have your sync server ready to go, you basically only have one machine with a folder syncing to nothing. So the next step is to add a second device and then share folders and things with it. And I have to say this was a bit of an awkward sort of setup. I mean, the obvious thing for me is I used a laptop and my phone as the two other devices that I was going to share with my main PC. So I'd have sort of three in a circle sharing things. And it's fine if you want to add the key to the phone. So for example, you've got your first machine that you've set up and you say, right, I need to share. So you add a device and you can pop up a QR code that you scan with your phone, and that saves you from typing in this unbelievably long number that defines the key. And that means that when you add it on your phone, it's quite quick. But you have to mutually add every device. So by adding it on your phone is no further forwards than it was until you actually add it back on your first PC. And that process is a bit lengthy because you can't read a QR code on your PC unless you have, webcams and certain software. So you either type in this really, really long code, which is 7 characters in 8 different sets. So 749, 56. Thank you very much, Paddy. Or you decide to copy that key from your phone, send it over email or via some other syncing software that you already have, and then put it in there. And then you can set it up. And once they've both been mutually added, they see each other, and you can then pick which folder to share after you've restarted a couple of times on both devices, obviously.
Oh, well, I did it with a Raspberry Pi and just made a text file of the key that I needed and just copied that over. And it was all relatively straightforward, really, to set up for me. And that seems to be a perfect use case, really, sharing stuff from a main machine to a Raspberry Pi and back again. And for me, it was slightly clunky to set up, but it honestly didn't feel any clunkier than setting up BitTorrent Sync.
I went down the same route as you, Jesse, the first time I did this and just assumed I would have to do all of it. The second time, because I got annoyed with it the first time and deleted it from everywhere and started again, the second time I did it, I obviously got distracted and went and made a coffee or something, and I walked back in to find out my mobile phone was saying, oh, there's this device wants to connect to you. Would you like to allow it? And it wants to share this folder with you. Would you like to allow it? And I realised it's actually got auto-discovery on both ends. It can actually pick up the keys of other devices on the local area network that are sort of sat there obviously broadcasting them out, so you don't have to go through that whole setup palaver. But I didn't see that actually documented in the interface on the Android app or the main application itself anywhere.
Yeah. So when I came to do my laptop, exactly as you said, I got distracted making a cup of tea and came back. And so in the GUI, it has sort of a pop-up that says either you need to restart or this has happened, or one of the other ones is, like you say, another device you've shared with wants to share back. Do you want to add it now or later? And off you go. So yeah, not such a palaver if you're a little bit patient.
Yeah, and that's a terrific feature. I'd just like them to actually put it in your face it's going to happen. Otherwise, you assume you're going to have to do things manually and waste your time.
But it does sort of come to a point that I've found through using Syncthing is maybe I'm impatient. Maybe I'm used to, Drive and Dropbox where things seem to be a lot more proactive and really happening as soon as you've done them. But there's just seems to be a lag when you do something, or if you change network, it takes a while to refine the devices and approve the handshake and say they're ready to go and things like this. It felt a little bit slow, but then I suppose I wasn't doing it from a point of view of having things synced and then in 2 days' time, I'll go and look at that document. I was syncing things and holding my phone, waiting for it to happen because I was doing this review and I was trying to make notes on what's going on. It didn't have the sort of snappiness, not just syncing, but discovering devices or when a new device comes back on the network and things like this. There was some lag there.
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to point out the Android app isn't an official one, is it? It's something that the community's developed, I believe. There is no official actual Android app for this.
Oh, it's quite good looking for an unofficial app, so give them credit for where it's due.
So among the feedback that we got about this, Dietmar mentioned that he'd had some issues syncing across the internet rather than across the local network. Now, I didn't get a chance to try it across the internet. Did either of you?
His point was that when you're on networks, they're administered by slightly strong-handed groups, i.e. whether you're at university or at work, they might have quite strong firewalls and restrictions and things. And he was having problems allowing the sync to happen there. Now, I did set it up to work outside my house by port forwarding the TCP and the UDP. And I had quite good success when I was just roaming around. I didn't try it on my work network, but just roaming around on the normal data with my phone. Things would sync nicely from the PC to the phone, but going back the other way, it wasn't quite as smooth. I'm not sure if that's my setup or if it's just a bit slow, but it wasn't as smooth as the download from the home network out to the remote device.
That's something I tried as well, because it's a feature I'd missed previously. Last time I looked at the Syncthing, it simply wasn't there. But they have relays now. So there are third parties out there. There are users running relays for the community, or you can set your own up if you like. And the idea is they act as an in-between, a go-between, if you like, between your local device and your remote device. So you can get around all this firewall tunneling malarkey just by using the relay settings. And that actually worked really well. I'd got my phone quite happily running on 4G outside of the house, syncing up through my BT firewall router thing, and it worked absolutely fine without having to open any ports or anything. It did actually run a little slower than syncing on a LAN, but I guess that's par for the course. So relays is a new feature in Syncthing I hadn't seen before, but it seemed to work quite efficiently for me.
And you didn't have to set up any port forwarding on your home router?
None whatsoever, no.
So when you started the server from within your home network, did it have one of those pop-ups on the GUI that said unable to activate UPnP something, something, something?
I honestly can't remember. I always set things up locally to start with, so I had my ThinkPad running the server, I had my Nexus 7 and my phone all connected to it on the LAN over wireless. And then I disabled wireless on my phone and went off. In fact, I went to Tesco's, did some shopping, and managed to sync up some files whilst I was in Tesco's.
Right. It would have been very obvious that was the first pop-up I had. Even when I just installed and just run Syncthing for the first time, it said, can't configure your router 192.168.1.1 with UPnP, go and do it yourself, basically. So perhaps the BT router is fundamentally differently set up and they're able to do all this plug and play for you, which makes it an absolute dream for an easy setup.
Okay, so when you first put this in the show doc, Paddy, you put in a photo of a statue doing a face palm, which I note is the first image on Google image search for facepalm. So you...
What can I say? I'm idle.
So I thought that you'd had a bad experience with this, but it seems like you haven't. So what was all that about?
Didn't have a bad experience. It worked, and it worked reasonably well. But that isn't enough. Jesse's alluded to this several times. It isn't like Dropbox or Drive, particularly Dropbox, where you install it and it works. There is configuration required. It might not be a great deal of configuration. I mean, you talked yourself about having to move a text file over onto your Raspberry Pi. You shouldn't be having to do this sort of thing. Somebody mentioned the attractive web interface it has for admin. It has got an attractively designed interface, but I think there's far too much information there. And the whole website for the Syncthing project, if you go and read the documentation on there, it's too complicated. It's great it's all there, and it's the sort of thing a techie or a developer would be interested to know about, but not for your end user. And it just frustrates me that things are presented, including in the Android app, in fairness. There's a hell of a lot of options exposed there. These things should be hidden away. They should not be surfaced to your end user. It should be a plug-and-play experience for your end user. If people want to delve in further, that's fine, but you don't get mass adoption by making things look complicated. I know there's an awful lot going on behind the scenes and below the surface, so that's fair enough, but you want to appear to be like a swan, at least, and just gracefully gliding along with it all just working with as little user intervention as possible. And it doesn't do that.
So maybe put that stuff in, a menu further deep in advanced options or something like that.
Yeah, I know it sounds really a picky thing to say, but you're not going to get the users that I think products like this need in order to make sort of peer-to-peer technology more prevalent when things are presented in a manner that's too complex for the average person to pick up. And I think it still is.
Okay, right. Well, that I think is a fair enough criticism. But let me return to why we are actually talking about this in the first place. We were talking about BT Sync and how there's no open source version of that and how it itself is not open source. And you, Paddy, were talking about how it's not even necessarily about using it in this way. It's about building services on top of that peer-to-peer technology. And the fact is that Syncthing is there. It is working sufficiently, I think, to do that. And the complexities of it shouldn't scare off someone who's going to develop stuff on top of it, because they're developers. That should be fine. So, back to that original point of, the FSF took it off their list and people assumed that was because of Syncthing. Well, why have we not got services built on top of this? Am I wrong? Is it not good enough?
I think that's really difficult to answer. I mean, my gut feeling about it is I didn't trust it whilst I was using it. But that isn't because it didn't work at any stage. This isn't like an OwnCloud experience where things go missing or very bad things happen to your data in transit. It worked for me, and it worked for me all of the time. And I was trying to work out why I felt uncomfortable about it. And I think purely it is the exposure of the complexity. I know there's a lot going on, but there's no need for it to show me that. I mean, there's a lot going on with Dropbox, but it doesn't show me that. It just works. And I think just working without showing you the complexity inspires confidence that it's going to carry on working. And that is all I could put it down to. It's just how it makes you feel, which seems a very flimsy thing from a technological point of view, but it's quite a crucial thing from a emotional point of view and just how humans actually behave.
It sounds like you wanted to remain ignorant and just have it working.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do. And that's how most other people are as well. And if that isn't the case, if it's making you become less ignorant, you can argue that's a good thing, but it isn't a way to become popular and get widely used.
I mean, to spell out a specific point to back up your argument about the complexity, I've got some notes here about the CPU and RAM usage on my PC, laptop and phone whilst I was syncing things and whilst it was idle. And I haven't gone through and done some complicated thing to pull those out. I've not been looking at HTOP or anything like this. It's just that it's there on the front screen for you to look at straight away. And that's I think what you're discussing is the fact that it's got all this information, and if it says it's using 3% of your processor whilst syncing these documents, you might think, is that a lot? Is that not a lot? Is this good? Is it going to be that all the time? And it just raises these questions that, I'm sure Dropbox is doing that in the background while it's doing some heavy syncing, but it then dies down to 0.0 something or other, and you don't actually need that in your face straight away.
Well, okay, some user interface issues aside, it does have quite a lot of control that you don't have with other similar kind of proprietary products. Like the granularity is pretty good there, isn't it?
Yes, there are options that you can have for setting master folders and introducer devices. So the fundamental sort of interfaces have a list of devices that you can share with if you choose, that you've done this double pairing with, and then a list of folders that you have locally that you can share with. And when you have multiple devices you've got on your device list, you can pick which ones of those you wish to share which folders with simple on-off ticks. And those devices, you can set as an introducer for. I know it's an odd way of putting it, because it's a bit backwards, whereby once you've linked two devices together, if the main PC you're using, let's say, wants to then share the device that your phone or your laptop or your Pi or what have you with another friend or somewhere else, you can then pass on that share. So you don't actually have to do the physical key thing with everyone if you've allowed one of your devices to be the introducer. And similarly, on the folder side, one of them can be the master. So basically any device which has that folder shared but is not the master, deletions don't get deleted on the master one. Only deletions are sort of fed down to the other synced devices if the master deletes it. So you can have, the number one folder, if you will, which commands the other ones. So it's not entirely level when it comes to sharing. You can have one which is sort of a higher tier, if you like, and the master, as they've called it. So there's a lot more granularity you can choose if you want to.
Yeah, you get quite a lot of flexibility in how you set things up and whether you want just straight peer-to-peer or some sort of hierarchical structure there.
Yes, hierarchy, that's the word I was looking for. And I need to ask a slightly stupid question, having spoken about it in such detail. So on my local network, I shared the keys between my phone and my PC, and then I set up my port forwarding, and I turned my phone Wi-Fi off, and it could still share, but I hadn't at any point told it my external IP. So there's some cleverness going on with those key pairs. Do we know how that's working?
I think that's via the relay mechanism I was talking about earlier.
But that implies that it's talking to some sort of server outside of my home, even though I'm starting it on my home network.
Yes. I mean, I could be wrong, but that was my understanding of how it was working and why it worked full stop for me without any port forwarding or any of that sort of nonsense.
Right, I see. Okay, that clarifies it.
Okay, so it sounds like we're fairly impressed with it, all told, and it might have a few issues, but generally speaking, it's a pretty decent bit of software. So I suppose it's a big thank you to everyone who wrote in and reminded us to have another look at it. On to the feedback then, and first of all, a huge thanks to our new monthly supporters, David Laxco, I think, and a mysterious anonymous person who didn't want their name read out. So thanks to both of you, and of course to our existing monthly supporters. It's very much appreciated.
It is. Thanks, guys.
And FOSS Talk Live update. If you go to fosstalk.com, you'll find out more about it, but it's basically a live show that we're doing in London in August with Linux Voice and the Ubuntu podcast and some other people like Stuart Langridge and Dave Megaslippers, which apparently is hilarious to John O'Bacon.
To most of us, actually, I think.
Okay. It's just what I've always known him as, so whatever. Anyway.
It's an unusual surname, let's be honest.
I think it's like Megan's Nicholas or something like that, and he's just calls himself Megaslippers on Twitter, so that's what I decided to put him as, and he didn't complain. But anyway, so all the tickets have gone for it, is the long and the short of it. That does not necessarily mean that you can't come if you want to come. So having a ticket at this stage means that you can definitely come into the downstairs bit where we are doing the live shows. Bear in mind that downstairs is in a pub, so the upstairs of it is obviously anyone over 18 can come in and drink in there, no problem. Also keep in mind that there will probably be some people who've got a ticket who don't come, and I'd appreciate it if you have got a ticket and you know you can't come, if you cancel that ticket and it then becomes available for other people to get. But what I'm getting at here is it's probably worth the risk of coming, and maybe you'll be able to get in. You probably will be able to get in, but there's no guarantee. Whereas if you've got a ticket, then you are guaranteed entrance. And I think that there'll probably be some kind of coming and going of people. Not everyone's going to want to watch all of the shows. So, even if you don't get in to watch the shows, there'll still be a social aspect upstairs, I would have thought. So, do come. FOSStalk.com if you want to find out more about it anyway.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to some of an Australian podcast that talks about Linux, let's say, and their view on our advertising on our website. So we have a DigitalOcean affiliate link, and obviously it's useful if people click on it and then we get money and DigitalOcean benefit from your custom and you get money off as well. And this podcast seemed to claim that we were advertising on the website. And I think it's basically, if you're going to put an affiliate link in, of course you're going to put the picture of that service so that people recognize the image. There seems to be some, they're stirring the waters, and we've got to fight back, boys.
Yeah, let's make a beef with them,
Yeah, make a beef with the people from the south.
Yes, well, all good fun anyway. And don't forget the merch as well. If you want Linux Luddites t-shirts and hoodie and mug and that sort of thing, linuxluddites.com/shop for all that. And contact details then. Yeah, if you want to get in contact, show@linuxluddites.com is the email address, or we're on Twitter at Linux Luddites, or there's a link to the Google Plus and Facebook communities on our website.
So first up, a point specifically for Joe here. He has written all of our intro and bumper music, and Rito asked if he could have the theme music so that he can have it on his ringtone, which had never occurred to me, if I'm honest. But I sort of want to ask the same question. So what are you doing about this, Joe?
I swear he wanted the Pi Podcast one because that's better than our thrashy thing that I did. I suppose I could do it. It's just getting around to it because it's kind of... actually, the Luddites one would be easier to do than the Pi Podcast one because that kind of fades out on my mix of it. But yeah, I'll get around to it. It's on my daily goal list just after Learn Esperanto.
Okay, right. So when it's ready, it'll probably be on Google Plus or something for a download.
Yes.
And we can all change our ringtones to Linux Luddites.
Go on then, let me drag it into the feedback proper. And starting with Floyd Wallace talking about Microsoft. And Floyd said, as far as Microsoft running Ubuntu on the command line, that's squarely aimed at the Rails community in my humble opinion. Developing for Rails and Windows is a mug's game. Most give up and move to either Mac OS or Linux. Paddy is exactly right. This is a play for Microsoft to preserve their big moneymaker, their Azure cloud services. I could easily see Microsoft offering their own integrated Linux with plug-and-play Exchange and SQL Server on the Azure cloud. It'd probably make money, and there are probably companies that would like the familiarity and easy remote access of Linux with software like Exchange and SQL Server on top. This setup would let them consolidate different servers into just one cloud service. But the interesting possibilities are on the desktop. Yes, I could see Microsoft buying Canonical, and as the only real growth in computer sales is in the cheap consumer end where netbooks and Chromebooks are, I could see Microsoft offering Ubuntu Linux on these. I think the reason Microsoft would offer an open source Linux designed to run on low-end computers with an Office port to Linux is to compete with Chromebooks in the education market and retain mindshare. A generation of school kids are going to grow up never having used Office or Windows if Google gets their way. That might be good for Google, but bad for Microsoft. The money spent on staying relevant in the educational market with a Microsoft Linux and low-cost Office suite is a rounding error in their catering budget, but would offer the only serious competition Google has at the moment.
Yeah, so I'd like to just apologise to Floyd there. I did cut his piece down quite a lot. But if you want to see the full words, it's on our website. And the really interesting point there is I think about Microsoft in the educational market, because when I was at school, IT was basically, this is how you use the Office suite, and you'd have a couple of lessons on Word and a couple of lessons on Excel, and obviously it's useful because when you go into the real world, no matter what you're doing, you're going to be producing documents, or you want to keep note of your own finances or produce a graph of data. You're going to need to know how to use Office suites, but it's not the Microsoft Office suite you should know how to use. It's just generally Word editors and calc and things like this that LibreOffice would allow you to use if they had a wider view on what learning Office suites was. Now, I'm sure IT at school has moved on. I would hope it has with the Raspberry Pi and things. But that did basically set me to be ready in the big wide world, knowing only Microsoft products. And it just so happens that my generation has entered the market with only Microsoft products at work. But now that the younger generation is using mostly Google products, or at least that's what the news would lead us to believe, it's interesting to see that they, when those people leave school, are they going to be wanting to use Google products mostly, or are they just going to start using Microsoft because that's what their company uses? Now, I'm used to the idea that we use a collaborative Google Doc for doing our show notes, and we can all look at it at the same time, we can all make changes, and that's fine. When I go to work and only one person at a time can open a Word document or an Excel sheet, it drives me mental. It's so annoying because I'm used to the way that, more modern setups like Google Drive and things are allowing you to share and be collaborative. So I think Microsoft is probably quite worried, and Floyd make that point, it's a fairly good idea. Whether or not Microsoft are going to buy Ubuntu, I'm not so sure about.
From what I've seen, they still are, and IT lessons haven't really changed that much. I mean, there's more emphasis on coding and stuff, but I think they are definitely still learning Microsoft products. So I don't think that they really need to do this Linux thing. But Florian chimed in and he said, I agree with Paddy and Floyd. It's about developers, but you missed the whole Docker spin on this. Some weeks or months ago, Microsoft announced that they'll be porting Docker to Windows. This is really where you get the current generation of web hipsters who want to bundle their stuff in containers and ship them to the cloud. If they don't have to go through the trouble of running a Linux VM, they might not feel the need to replace Windows on their devices. There's also the kind of company that lets you only use a tightly locked down Windows machine. While they're obviously not too developer friendly in the first place, they might be able to control their web folks easier with such a setup. And for money saving reasons, they're probably not running all their stuff on Windows servers.
Yeah, I'm not sure how big Docker is in the sort of the whole ecosystem when we're talking about Windows versus Linux and server side. I know it seems to be making quite a big splash, but I'm still to be convinced as just how big a splash that is. Stick with Microsoft feedback still, Richard Walker got in touch and said, I just wanted to say regarding Bash on Windows, I've used MobeXterm for years on Windows, which gives native Bash emulation, maybe limited, but nothing new. You may want to check it out. I only use Windows due to no choice at work. I'm still fighting for Linux workstations. Why is it cool for enterprises that are happy to run Linux on their servers, but not on their client computers?
That's a question that I've often wondered. Is it because Microsoft's sales team are so good, perhaps?
I think it's for a host of reasons that we've talked about on the show previously. I mean, there's the familiarity aspect, which we talked about. There's the fact that only certain packages are available on Windows and aren't actually physically available on Linux currently, which are fairly standard in certain niche siloed markets. The things even with Excel, for instance, I mean, never mind the fact that Excel far exceeds the capabilities of Calc. You've got macros and you've got huge, great big complicated workflows that are designed around Microsoft macros and bits integrated into the Office suite. And that means that you can't just take LibreOffice and put it in as a drop-in replacement.
Are you trying to tell me that although Linux is pretty good for servers and clearly the best, it's a bit rubbish on the desktop?
I'm trying to tell you that there are established workflows and bits of software out there on the desktop, and without a compelling case to change those, they're going to remain on the desktop. Yeah,
if you replace the word Linux with Macintosh, I think you'd have exactly the same discussion, because I don't expect to go to a big engineering company and then say, here's a Mac. I would be completely thrown. And, I'm probably one of the people who'd be most ready to understand that while it looks different, you just need to find those settings and those features and, like you said, macros and things in whatever it is that Mac has. Whereas the majority of people would just be thrown by the idea. I mean, for example, we were moving from XP to Windows 7 a couple of years ago, and at one point half the machines were XP and half of them were Windows 7. And a guy was on the phone to IT department and they said, are you on Windows 7 or Windows XP? And he said, well, I don't know. And I'm sat there thinking, it's blatantly obvious which one it is. Look at it. It's the start button is different. The way the windows are made is different. It's fundamentally different. But he just didn't see it. He was not interested in that level. And so for you to go into a big company and then say we're using this different setup, it would throw too many people. So I'm with Paddy that it's just ingrained in people. And while more and more of the infrastructure is becoming Linux based, it's just going to take a while for it to move over, if it ever actually moves, before we find the next paradigm in computing or whatever.
Yeah, but maybe we're talking about Microsoft too much on this show. Well, maybe not. Bruce certainly thinks so. And Bruce said, Microsoft's been a subject on numerous Linux podcasts since the start of the new year. And frankly, I side with Joe and find it extremely worrisome. Mostly because the Linux press seems to be priding itself thinking that Linux has stolen so many developers or dominated the server space, and now Microsoft is caving in and realizing that the jig is up. Most troubling has been the 2 or 3 pieces of Microsoft press about entering the open source market. In all of them, they've clearly stated that their sole purpose is giving people in the open source community the opportunity to become familiar with and comfortable in using Microsoft products as a matter of course so that they may be better integrated. Historical track records count for a lot, and I'm sorry, but I think it's important to cut off the oxygen in providing free positive press for Microsoft from its most ardent opponents. They're certainly capable of looking after themselves without us trumpeting their campaigns.
Well, I think we better move on from Microsoft then.
Agreed.
So we discussed adult content on the web and whether or not it should be filtered or who should have control over it. And Damien Carroll's got in touch to say, in America, adult content on TV is pretty much relegated to nighttime showings, much like you stated it is in the UK. However, at least on some cable channels, there isn't always a viewer discretion warning. It's just expected of the parents not to allow their kids to watch late-night HBO. Same idea with on-demand content. There's no age verification required, just optional parental controls. So why should the internet be any different? It's not like going into a shop is the same as looking through Amazon pages. Parents don't typically try to take their kids into a sex shop. In fact, many parents, from my experience, seem to enforce the idea of never go in there. So why threaten the livelihood of some extremely profitable businesses? Just make it easy to install a whitelist or blacklist, or have UK telecoms provide an account-wide whitelist blacklist for domains they don't want their child, guest, whoever to access. It's basically like the morality laws that made prostitution, gambling, marijuana, opium, and alcohol illegal in the US. The government's telling us what is and isn't okay to be interested in, and that's simply too far.
I suspect Paddy might agree with that sentiment just a bit.
Yeah, just a bit. We're kind of out of time, though. Control over people's lives is extending ever further down from the government, isn't it? And it's going to continue that way when Hillary gets in.
Stop with the politics all the time, honestly. But yeah, I think that making an optional whitelist or blacklist is a reasonable idea, although there are always going to be ways to get around that, and you can't catch everything with it. It always comes back to me to decent parenting. If you are good at being a parent, then you'll teach your kids or supervise them or whatever. You know, you don't need other people to do your job for you. And if you do, then, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't have had kids in the first place.
So we're not going to talk about politics, but we are going to do parenting advice. Right,
yeah.
Okay.
Parenting advice from someone who has no kids and will never have kids. That makes me the best authority, I think.
Yeah, I've seen them in like supermarkets and stuff making loads of noise, yeah. I'll tell them how it is.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that'll do it for the feedback then. Let's move on to something that at least Jesse and I find pretty exciting. I'm delighted to say that we're now joined by Preetam D'Souza, who is the lead developer of Maru. So welcome.
Hey, guys.
Now, Maru is a really exciting project to me because on the face of it, it's just a normal Android ROM. So we're talking about a Nexus 5 ROM, which just looks like AOSP, and it's, you know, no offense, but it's quite boring until you plug it into an HDMI screen, and then suddenly you have Debian. And I'm absolutely amazed by it. So I'm really, really glad that you've been able to join us and talk about this.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I've talked a little bit about what it is there, but can you give us your kind of sales pitch for it?
Right. So Maru really is a new way of looking at personal computing. The way that hardware is advanced nowadays, like mobile hardware is so far ahead of desktop hardware that it doesn't really make sense that we're only using our mobile devices for, taking calls, making texts, and, small little apps. I noticed that my laptop is running a dual core processor right now, and my Nexus 5 or Nexus 5X are running these quad core souped up hardware. Why can't we use those things to get some real productive work done? So I decided to create Maru. And the whole purpose with creating Maru was to really bridge mobile and desktop computing. It's the most convenient thing you can possibly have. I mean, what else do you want? You got this great machine in your pocket. It just doesn't make sense to not use it for productive work. So why not use that with an external display and peripherals like a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse to have a full-fledged desktop?
Yeah, exactly. And you're not the only person working on this. I know Microsoft and Canonical are certainly working on similar things.
That's right.
So in this case, how does it actually work then? Because you've got Android 5.1.1, I think, and Debian. So how do you what's the kind of under the hood? What's going on with it?
Right. So as you guys mentioned earlier, this is 5.1.1 AOSP, mostly stock, nothing crazy going on the Android side other than the pieces necessary to make the Debian experience great. You can think of it as basically two systems running on the same kernel. It uses the Linux containers project to do the virtualization between both systems. And the real innovation with Maru is the bridging of the desktop into Android's display stack and all of those. Maru basically runs both systems on top of the same kernel, and it bridges these things together.
So it's not a Chroot environment then?
No, it's not. So Chroot is really, you can think of it as probably, if you were to graph virtualization on the spectrum, I would put Chroot like all the way on the left, like the simplest form of virtualization you could possibly have, right? Just the root file system virtualization. What Maru does instead is take Chroot and kind of put it on steroids, and it not only virtualizes the root file system, but virtualizes everything in a Linux container, right? So your network namespace, device namespace, all that stuff is sort of separated out. So you get this really nice clean separation between Android and Linux that wasn't possible before.
So you've talked about containers there, and just so I can clarify exactly how this is working, you've got the kernel which is shared, and is Linux a container within Android, or are they sort of both in containers sharing the same kernel?
So Android you could sort of think of Android as the host almost, and the Linux is running as almost like a guest container on Android, but yes, they do share the same kernel.
And I suppose the question is, why Debian? Why not something like Ubuntu that's got a longer support cycle, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I first announced it, I guess I didn't announce it with that much information, and so a lot of the press kind of spun it as, Debian for Android. But that's really not what Maru is. Maru really is the infrastructure to unite Android and Linux. And that Linux distribution can be whatever it wants to be. I chose Debian because I was the most familiar with it, and it worked really well, actually. I did experiment with Ubuntu as well, but there was a lot of annoyances with Upstart and some stuff related to that. But I found Debian and systemd to work, really great. So
a preliminary question to my next question. How many of you are working on the Maru project?
Just me.
Okay, right. That sort of paints the picture. And this sounds like something. I mean, Joe touched upon the fact that other people, other companies are doing this and have been working at some sort of convergence or whatever the Microsoft term is for it, where we're bringing the desktop and the phone together. And it seems like this is the most obvious use. Both Linux and Android sharing a kernel. I mean, the phone still works while it's plugged in, so right. you can use the phone and you can use your desktop. So I mean, I don't know quite how to ask this, but was it a lot of work? I don't understand how one guy has done this when surely this is something that big companies have been aiming for.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it was a hell of a lot of work. I don't know how I did it now looking back on it, but I think it was really driven by that vision that you could use your phone as your desktop. It was really exciting to me. It seemed like something new at the time, because at the time when I first started this, I knew about the Ubuntu Edge project, but I hadn't heard about Continuum when I started working on this. So I was like, okay, the Edge project, it raised a lot of money, but it failed. I can't seem to get my hands on any sort of Ubuntu and what is it called, Ubuntu for Android. So I was like, well, no one's doing this right now. How can I make this happen? And so I started doing my research. I decided that it was possible, and I just started diving in. It took me about a year to build it. So it was a lot of work, though, for sure.
Yeah, I'll bet. And so, I mean, we maybe should have asked this at the top of the interview, but what's your background and how come you've got the tools in your toolkit to do this kind of project?
Right. So my background, I went to college at the University of Pennsylvania. I have and I graduated with dual degrees in business and computer science. My background's kind of always been in technology. My dad is one of the best engineers I know, so I kind of grew up with computer engineering and electronics and things like that. When I was a kid, I used to like leaf through hardware brochures, like during the AMD versus Intel wars, for example, where we were comparing, all the clock speed wars that we had over there. It's pretty exciting. So I've always been involved in hardware and seeing how that's progressed. And it was really that interest in hardware and my involvement in that field that had me first notice that mobile hardware had gotten to the point where Linux desktops running on your device at the same time as Android, that was really a good possibility, and performance would be fairly good.
And so why the Nexus 5? Just because you had one? And
yeah, I just happened to have one. Honestly, this is just kind of my side project that I did. I happened to have a Nexus 5, and Nexus works great because Google makes all of the device binaries available. So it's very easy to port. I think that's why we see a lot of these new things on the Nexus devices.
But it is presumably well capable of running on any device given the right drivers then?
That's correct.
That's good to hear. And one issue that I had, probably the only downer about it, is the fact that you have to leave the screen on the phone. Otherwise, the screen on your monitor goes off. Mm-hmm. Is that a major issue? I mean, presumably it's something you're trying to work on, but is that fixable?
That one's a little tricky because Android, when you hit the power button, your screen, it suspends the display controller for your device. So in order to keep the Linux on while your Android device is sleeping would require me probably to do some modifications in some of the very low level stuff at how the display controller is working. For now, the workaround is to keep your device charged while you have the slim port cable. Usually there's slim port cables with the USB charger extension.
Yeah.
If you do that, I've actually made the default for Android to go into Daydream. So your display will just kind of sleep and show a clock for now while your Linux desktop is still running. Have you had a chance to try that out?
No, I just turned the brightness to the minimum and set the wallpaper to be black. And just let the battery run down.
I made sure that the sleep was half an hour or whatever the longest is for the phone display to turn off, and you didn't notice it that often. But I did also charge it, but obviously I didn't notice that it hadn't gone off because I'd set it half an hour. The only other thing that I noticed, and perhaps this is already in place, was I was trying to share a document between my desktop experience and back on the phone. Is there like a particular folder or something that you can share things between? Because I couldn't find it.
Right, there is. If you go to the desktop and you look for, there's a folder called Phone there, and if you open it up, it actually mounts the SD card for your device. So I think I mount documents, music, folders like that, and those are both visible between Android and Linux.
I did have a few permissions issues with that. I couldn't.
That's right.
I had to sudo to write to that.
Right. Yeah. There's some issues with, especially drag and drop in the file manager. I've noticed that as well. Those things need to be ironed out.
Yeah. Well, it is 0.2.2, so we will forgive you that, I think. So why XFCE then?
Well, yeah, so I picked that as the desktop environment because I think it's the most lightweight one that I was playing around with, because there's still a lot of improvements I'd like to make on the graphics performance, and using a heavier environment like GNOME or something like that can be a little bit problematic, especially because battery's pretty tight right now anyways.
Yeah, but you're kind of stuck in XFCE. I tried to install LXDE and log out, and it wouldn't work. That's presumably to do with the container then. Yeah,
it does. That's on my list of things to fix, actually.
Yeah, because it would be nice, because some people prefer a different desktop that, they might be willing to sacrifice performance for KDE or GNOME or whatever.
Yeah, it makes total sense. You can actually, all the packages come down fine, but there's some weirdness involved with the session switching that needs to be fixed.
Yeah. Now, one thing I did try was flashing the Google apps on there, and that worked absolutely fine. Mm-hmm. So presumably you're just not doing that for legal reasons then.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, but it's it seems to work just absolutely like any other. But how come you did AOSP and not CyanogenMod then? Because I personally like the customizations that they do.
Yeah, I mean, it's because I personally like AOSP.
Fair enough. Yeah.
No, but honestly, it's because I haven't played too much with CyanogenMod. I flashed it on my phone a few times. I think on my old Galaxy Nexus, and it didn't really work very well. But that was back like maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It may be working great now. I don't really know. But I always enjoy AOSP's stability, and I wanted to make sure that if I put Maru out, that I wasn't dealing with bugs from CyanogenMod. I wanted most of my bugs to be due to my own development.
Yeah, makes sense.
And so, speaking about development, what are the things that you've got in mind for improvements in the near and, I suppose, medium future?
Right. So then my number one priority is probably load balancing better a little bit. The Maru project right now is really single-threaded. It's kind of me kind of doing everything right now. So my first priority is the open source project, which I'm working on this month. And I hope to get that out. So, because I mean, there's a lot of people who want to get involved. I want to see as soon as we can get some more people involved in the project. I expect us to see Maru on a lot more devices, which is one of the key requests I've been getting from a lot of people. The Nexus 5 is great, but it is pretty old now. I'd like to see this on a lot newer devices.
So when you said single-threaded, you mean your work single-threaded, not the CPU?
No, my work, yeah.
Right, gotcha. Okay, I was going to say the performance on that's the thing that really struck me was the performance on the desktop is acceptable. I mean, it's better than Raspberry Pi. It's not going to be as good as a 8-core, Intel x86, and then you can still use the phone at the same time. It doesn't feel like it's suffering at all. It did make me wonder, sort of, how much overhead is in these CPUs, which are sat on our phones, not really doing anything a lot of the time.
That's exactly it. That's actually one of the key reasons why I even thought this whole project was possible, because we have, as I was saying earlier, we have these many core SoCs, but most of the time the apps that we run are single-threaded, right? So it just doesn't really make, I mean, you have let's say you have a quad-core device, which is pretty normal nowadays. Typically 2 or 3 of those cores are sitting idle, so you may as well run a Linux desktop on it, right?
Yeah, you might as well make use of them. So you're saying have you recently open sourced it, or you're due to?
Yes, I'm working on the open source project right now. It's not, the code isn't available just yet. I'm still figuring out some of the licensing issues and figuring out where I want to host my repositories and all that stuff, but it's coming soon.
And so to what extent is it going to be open source? Is it going to be everything except for the blobs that you've had to use for the drivers?
Exactly, yes.
Oh, excellent. And so what license? I mean, you've said licensing is a bit of a murky issue there, but what are you going to go permissive, or are you going to lock it down with GPL?
I'm pretty sure I'm going to go permissive on this one. Of course, there are parts in the Linux desktop that are GPL, obviously.
Yeah. It's
a little bit weird because I'm shipping, it's like Android and Linux, so Android is licensed under Apache, but it gives me the right to sublicense that. Of course, all the Linux parts are unmodified, so they go with their licenses. I'm definitely leaning towards the permissive licenses, though, because the GPL honestly scared me when even I was developing Maru. I didn't know if I was doing something legally wrong or what.
It does sound like you're going into a quagmire with, let's say, Android and Linux sharing the one thing. So,
right.
But best of luck with that one.
Yeah, thanks.
So in terms of the help that you're looking for, I mean, I suppose there's not a great deal people can do at the moment until that code's out there then.
Exactly. That's why that was my first priority.
And have you got a kind of timeline for that then?
Again, I'm trying to focus it on this month. I kind of made it a thing that I don't give ETAs.
Very wise, yes.
Because I know I'm going to get screwed down the road. But I think CyanogenMod has a similar concept, no ETAs. But that's most of my focus this month. So you guys shouldn't have to wait much longer for it.
Oh, that'd be great. It will be really good for other people to try it out because, with it being just on one device, it's if you're lucky like me to have one, then you can try it. But it'll be good if people can port it to Samsung devices and all that kind of stuff.
You mean you had one, Joe? You had one, and now I have it. So
I'm having it back. But one thing that I've got to tell you about, and I suppose I could have told you about this off air, but I made a video this week with the Nexus 5. where I filmed just a couple of short clips, one selfie and one of the desktop running. And I made title cards in GIMP and edited it together with OpenShot and produced. It was only standard definition, okay? It wasn't any 1080p. But the fact that for me was a real milestone. I put together a video and uploaded it and published it to YouTube and then tweeted about it all from one device. And that to me is, that's really impressive. That's why I wanted to get you on, because it's funny that we talked about Microsoft and Canonical, and, they've got whole teams of people working on this. And I think that what makes me really impressed by this project is that instead of trying to create something completely new, you've taken two good things and put them together. I mean, that just seems like a logical way of doing things rather than, not invented here syndrome.
Exactly. That's what it was. I knew Android worked best on mobile, and I knew Linux worked great on desktop. So why not just combine those things together?
Exactly. Yeah. So if people want to find out more about it, then what is it, maruos.com?
Yep, it's maruos.com. And you can also follow the Twitter account GetMaru.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely stick some links to that in the show notes. So, thank you very much for coming on the show and telling us about it. And more importantly, thanks a lot for making it.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks so much, Joe and Jesse, for inviting me.
I'm sorry I missed that, actually. It sounded really interesting. It's a hell of an effort from one guy.
Indeed, it is. That was the biggest surprise. I thought that it would be Pritam and a bunch of people that he knows working on it. And I think that as soon as that code gets out there, there will be more people working on it. But yeah, for one person to do that is quite impressive.
Yeah, and you touched on that again. It's something you talked about in the interview. I mean, it's still not open source, is it? And that really needs to happen to get additional developers on board.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is two things happening here. One of them is the licensing issues, which are quite complicated with Android, aren't they, to be fair, because you've got Linux and you've got some other stuff going on. And so he needs to clarify that. But also there's the fact that, I mean, Paddy, you have developed enough code to know that when you've been working on something on your own for a long time, there's a lot of ugly hacks and things that could do with being tidied up before you put it out there and embarrass yourself. So, it might well be a case of that he's just doing that at the moment. But I do think that it is going to get open sourced, and I do think it's going to happen fairly soon, because something that wasn't in the interview there, but that Jesse and I found out, was that he's actually quit his job and is working on this full time at the moment. So he clearly really believes in it.
Oh, again, that shows you how committed he is to the cause, and that's a really encouraging thing. The thing that struck me throughout the conversation, though, was that this isn't convergence in the canonical sense that we've been talking about previously, as you've actually got two different code bases running on two different file systems. And Jesse, I think you mentioned about sharing documents between the two. So it's clever what is going on here, but I don't quite see why, Joe, in particular, you were so excited about it.
Because I don't think that convergence, as Canonical see it, is the way forward, is the bottom line. I don't think that trying to shoehorn two very different experiences together is ultimately what I want. And, we've talked about Remix OS and what's happening with Android. And I don't think that windowing Android and trying to make Android into a desktop operating system is a viable thing to do, or a useful thing to do. It's certainly not something I'm interested in. Whereas having one device that is powerful enough to be my phone and also plug in and do all the desktop stuff is what I want. And I just don't think that having one operating system is the way to do that. Okay, the file system thing, it would be, fairly straightforward to have a partition or a directory that the two of them shared. And, that there's some permissions issues at the moment, but that's stuff that can be fixed and will be fixed. But I don't think that I want to run the same applications on two different form factors, is the bottom line. I think that I like my Android applications the way they are, and I like my Linux applications, my Linux desktop applications the way they are. And so, I don't want to kind of jam them together. I think that this solution is what I personally have been looking for.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, Joe, about having applications which are specifically written for the desktop and others which are specifically written for the phone interface. But is what you're implying, Paddy, that Canonical are pushing for people to develop their software so that it can both be a useful program on the desktop, and also it then merges magically to have a more simplified, stripped down version on the phone, and so it has this one code base. Are you saying that that's a better place because you have one application on both devices rather than, for example, if I wanted to have a writing application, I need one note-taking app on my Android phone and then a second word processor on my Debian desktop? It would be nicer to have one that merged those two. Is that what you're sort of getting at?
Not really, although I can see the benefits of that approach. I mean, having a single code base does make sense, and I can understand why Canonical are doing it. I mean, I think I've expressed previously, well, I know I've expressed previously when we were talking about our predictions that the whole Convergence ship, I think, has sailed, and it doesn't really matter what the OS is and what the platform is. All the converged features you're going to see will happen because of things that are going on in the cloud, and it's nothing to do with your local device whatsoever. So in a way, for me, it doesn't really make any odds whether it's separate code bases or not. I was just curious about the different approach. I mean, I believe Microsoft want to have a unified code base, but aren't there at the moment, and they've got two different code bases. But I was just trying to get to the bottom of why you, Joe, felt this was something really to get behind, when, although it's clever technically, it doesn't mesh with what's been sold to us as the convergence dream.
Well, that's because I don't believe in it. And Jesse, you used a very interesting word there when you were talking about what Ubuntu are trying to do with the idea of making your application magically work on both form factors, because it does require magic. It's impossible. The bottom line is that on a phone, it's based around touch input, and it's just a very different experience from what you're doing with a desktop computer or a laptop. And so for me, there's just no point trying to do something that I see as impossible. I think that clever integration of the data of various applications, and I mean, you touched on it there with the cloud, Paddy, being able to edit a Google Doc on both form factors is nice, and all you need is a web browser on the desktop and the app, or indeed the web browser on the phone. You could easily have some config files that are shared across the two OSs on the one device. Well, I say easily, it'd be fairly difficult to do, but it is doable at least. And, you know, I just look forward to a time when I can have one computer. I mean, that clearly won't be the case because I have millions of old laptops lying around that I like to tinker with. But for my main machine, if I could do this podcast on my phone, if it was powerful enough and if the software running on it was good enough, and, you know, I would argue that we're not there yet, probably with either. But in the future, if I could have it so that I just plug it into a screen and some sort of hub or whatever, and get this podcast going, and then I can just unplug it and take it out to the pub with me, that would be the dream for me. And I don't think that these convergence ideas are going to achieve that for anyone. I don't think anyone would ultimately be that interested in it. I think that approaches like Maru are much more on the money with what people will ultimately want. And most people probably won't ever use the other operating system on it, the Linux one. Most people will just use it, or mostly use it as the phone. But occasionally, when they want to write a letter or print something out or whatever, they will then plug it into the peripherals. So I don't know, maybe it's just hit a spot that I've been looking for, and maybe I'm over-egging this pudding, and maybe no one else will be interested in it. But given what Pritam has said about how many people are interested, I think that, you know, I'm not alone here.
No, it's seriously impressive for one guy to come out with.
Yeah, I really look forward to trying out new versions of it, and when it becomes properly open source and people start porting it to other devices, I think it's going to take off, and, you know, some of those issues that we talked about in the interview will hopefully be ironed out, and I think this is going to be a serious player. And as I said to him before we did the interview, I'd be surprised if he's working alone on this for very long before someone like Google or Microsoft or even Canonical comes calling. But with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks with more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, peeps.
See you later.